Today I'm going to talk about privacy by design, and I'll do that by giving a very brief introduction and list the requirements from GDPR, and then I'll move on to some of the challenges on actually applying privacy by design at the large scale and some of the strategies we have come up with at Uber. So privacy by design, while it is popularized by GDPR, is actually a quite old notion. It exists since 1995. When it was first introduced, some high-level principles were there, including user-centricity, transparency, privacy as the default setting, and positive sum. So it's not privacy versus security, privacy versus safety, privacy and security, and privacy and safety. These principles were applied in specific domains, such as smart grids and online target advertising, but because they're quite high level and they did not supply specific methodologies, they've never become popular, and they were also not enforced by a legislation. So GDPR is the first one that actually requires privacy by design and by default. And when you look at GDPR, the particular article, you will not find specific requirements like encryption for health data or a specific control. You will have to come up with the controls yourself, but they need to satisfy certain requirements. So the controls you choose have to be appropriate. What that means is it has to actually reduce the privacy risk towards an individual. So you cannot have this umbrella set of controls, let's say encryption, and say, yes, we are now GDPR compliant. You have to actually reduce the risk. It has to be appropriate for the problem you're trying to solve. It has to be effective, so you need to demonstrate that your controls are actually working. You can do it with some quantitative metrics or also qualitatively, for example, having expert checks or having some audits. You have to think about state of the art, so you do not need to worry about experimental technologies, but you have to follow the industry best practices and the standards that are coming out recently. Cost can never be a reason not to comply, but if you have a cheaper control that is as effective as a more expensive control, you can opt in for the cheaper control. An example is if you're tied to a vendor and the vendor is charging a lot on automated deletions, you can do periodic removals if that is cheaper for you. And finally, you need to think about the context, the purpose, and the risk. So for example, if you have health data and you want to do marketing for that, the controls you have to be in place has to be much stronger than just name and address and marketing. For example, if you want to send some product information for sleep apnea to an individual, that can actually imply that the individual is suffering from sleep apnea. So just sending it by email is probably not the wisest choice. And finally, GDPR requires privacy controls to be embedded in all software development lifecycle. So not just on the design or just launch phase, but you need to be already thinking about privacy when you make a decision on the tech stack, on your vendor, and you're thinking about prototypes. And after you launch, the job is not over. You have to look into the effectivity of controls. You have to deal with data breaches if there is any. Data has to be deleted when no longer needed, and vendors have to be checked. And the NIST privacy framework that is released this month is also mentioning this, that privacy has to be thought about all development life cycles. So now, these are the requirements from GDPR, and there are also some guidelines coming from the authorities. One thing they have in common, they assume that the software development lifecycle is clearly sequential and it's clearly separated. So there's a waterfall model. So you have your requirements, you will look into it, you will put your privacy controls into design, and you just evaluate it during the testing. And it also assumes you have a rather simple software using a monolithic architecture so that you know where to place your controls. And it also lists the rather well-known privacy principles, such as transparency, data minimization, and accuracy. So the job is simply to include them into your design. But in complex architectures such as Uber, there is another challenge. So for example, at Uber, we have an iOS app, Android app, actually over 30 apps, and we have web services. We have many of these services that do one thing well and rely on others to fulfill the task. And in the end, it looks like a snowflake like this, over 3,000 web services that are used, that is not really visible to the end user, but it's all happening behind the scenes. So this creates particular challenges. And the second development is Agile is a quite popular methodology that is being adopted by many of the companies. And the change here is that you do not have requirements that are fixed where you can just put your privacy controls. You need to be able to expect the change and change your controls accordingly. So particular challenge we see from these two developments is you have distributed data, you have a mix of structured and unstructured data by different technologies, and to actually discover them, off-the-shelf tools won't always work, won't always scale. And another particular challenge here is that you do not have stable architectural documentation. So implementation might not match the documentation. The originals, owners might not be with the company, so you might not know why a particular decision was made in that particular architecture. So again, to understand the system, you do not have a very good documentation all the time. To deal with this, the first thing we had to do is actually classify the type of personal data we have at Uber. So the list of tiers that we have defined range from highly restricted to public. So highly restricted would be such as driver's license, that's highly linkable and has a big privacy impact. But you also have confidential information such as make and model and color of a car for a driver that does not always link to a particular individual, but given a data set could be linkable. And you also have, of course, public information that is already available and released, such as in product brochures. So after defining these tiers, the job is not over. So often how this works is privacy legal will look into existing legislations and come up with a draft list of personal data categorizations. And privacy engineering and information security will think of appropriate controls and will look into real-life cases with other stakeholders. And this will be done in an iterative fashion, so the classification and controls will be applied during privacy reviews, and the policy is changed accordingly from real-life experiences. So now we have a list of privacy personal data categorizations. The next step is, of course, to have a data inventory. This is needed to understand where the personal data is, what sort of personal data is there, and to think of further controls. This we do with automated tagging of personal data after determining the owners and specific systems, and then verifying of this tagging. And of course, your data inventory will mature as you go. So at the first start, you will be able to do tagging at database level. Then you have to move to a tagging at column level. And finally, you should be able to identify all data of an individual and actually monitor this. So at the start, you will be able to know which systems do I have and who are the owners. And later, you should be able to detect some violations where the policies is not being used, such as sensitive data being copied to a repository that is not appropriate for this purpose. And the output of this is very important. It will have to feed into several processes, such as privacy reviews, privacy rights processes, that often gets improved with data inventory, a good data inventory. Second challenge we see from this microservice environment is how do you actually determine the threat when you evaluate a particular microservice? Let's say you evaluate the one with the red dot, that particular service, and you place necessary controls, but some privacy risk can still remain if another service is reading data from it and it affects another service. That brings the question, where do you place the control? So let's say the yellow dot is the service that is connected to multiple ones. Ideally, you want to put your control there. For example, retention. You don't want to solve it at every single initiative and every single project, but you first need to know that the blue and red are connected to the yellow, and they always get connected to a service that is privacy vetted. And privacy can be a slow activity compared to Agile, because you have multiple stakeholders. You have legal that has a specific perception of risk. You have InfoSec, you have product owners that have an idea, and to determining privacy risk for a product that will exist later, that can be slow. You have legacy systems, of course, and they come with privacy debt. These systems exist since many years, and a lot of others rely on those. So changing them and making improvements can be difficult. And finally, this costs a lot of resource and time. You have a limited set of privacy experts to cover the whole domain. Actually takes some effort. So how we do solve this, or at least make an attempt at it, is having technical privacy reviews. So we offer a service to engineers, and when they're designing their system or having some ideas, we will discuss with them and ask the questions such as, which personal data are you collecting, and where are you going to get it from, and where will you actually store it? Who will have access to it? Why do you actually need it, and how long do you need it? And finally, we have services such as a data deletion service, which I'll discuss in a second, a consent service, export service, so that the engineers can onboard with these services without an effort. So this kind of pushes the question and socializes the data handling classification we have and brings privacy into their minds. The outcome is technical privacy requirements. For this specific project, there will be a list of mitigations. Some will have to be prioritized, have to be there before launch. Some have to be there in a reasonable amount of time, but can be done later. And we will give our input to privacy legal as well so that they can do their compliance assessment. But as I said, assessing one particular service doesn't mean the privacy review is done. Based on the discovered knowledge, we will look into the platforms, larger platforms, and detect them and embed privacy into them. And we will also update our standards based on the knowledge. It's always an iterative process. And one final thing to tackle the resource issue, of course, we have a limited set of privacy experts, and those privacy experts often don't have the low-level technical knowledge of each and every system. And what we have piloted is a privacy champions program. So privacy champions are the main point of contact within an organization. They are responsible for training and creating privacy awareness within their organization. And at later stages, we would expect them to have things like actually detecting potential privacy issues, trigger a privacy review if it hasn't started yet, and actually help with validation, since they often have the low-level knowledge. The final challenge I want to discuss about doing privacy at scale and deletion as a particular case. At Uber, we have multiple use cases for deletion. So this can be initiated by the user. So they might be asking their account to be deleted, and any associated data has to expire. There might be inactive users, and their accounts have to be deleted because they're no longer with the platform. Finally, there might be a specific period of time where we need to keep this data, and that needs to be deleted when that time passes. So again, as I said, there is a variety of data stores, and how deletion can be implemented, the strategy will differ. And you have to do it in a scalable manner, because there are over 70 million active monthly users at Uber, 7 million drivers, over 700 countries. So deletion has to account for these challenges. It has to be reliable. So even if a deletion attempt fails, that has to be detected and later retried again. It has to be adaptable. If the requirements, legal requirements change, how system handles it has to adapt to it. And it has to be demonstratable. So there should be some audit trail to show that deletion has actually occurred. So how this is solved is that there is a deletion service at Uber that actually orchestrates the deletion and tracks whether deletion has occurred properly. So it talks to data custodian services that are the main owners of data and tracks whether deletion has happened properly. And also it ensures that there is a cool-off period, so in case users change their mind or there's an account takeover, so that we do not want this particular user's data to be deleted, and that can also be implemented. And this system supports this large scale of data and data stores. We continuously onboard new services to this service for data to be deleted. And there's always a discussion with legal to understand which data should be deleted and when it should be deleted. And it also has to be rather frictionless so that it's easy for engineers to onboard to this service so that there is no real challenge. So the conclusions I have in this talk is privacy controls need to be chosen by the organization and later be demonstratable. So there are no requirements you will find in GDPR. And existing guidelines that we see do not always address the challenges of agile and microservice environments. So what we do currently is fix what you can, insert the right privacy controls into your project, but then discover the bigger challenges and always keep iterating because the requirements and underlying systems can change. And finally, providing privacy tools and services that are easy to adapt to engineers really makes a difference. Thank you.